The key to stability in West Asia has very different definitions in American and Persian dictionaries. Iran says stability can be maintained only by regional unity and secured by regional powers. The US appears to see stability in omitting regional powers and sowing discord among neighbors. There's over 11,500 kilometers between the US and Iran. Welcome to Iran Today. I'm Leila Faramarzi, bringing you the topic of stability and instability in the region of West Asia or the Middle East. To put it in US terms, instability is synonymous with Iranian policy in the region. Now, how can that be, given two things? One, the fact that the region is Iran's own neighborhood, and two, recent events unfolding in America show anything but stability in the US itself. We are talking bearskins and horns in the capital as pro-Trump protesters attacked to overturn election results. Let's hear what Mr. Parkain has to say. He's our former ambassador and foreign ministry veteran.
Americans are now facing serious instability in their own country, but at the same time they did not leave our region. This is because the US has managed to remain a superpower throughout its history due to its presence in the Middle East and West Asia. Today, this active presence no longer exists, which is why Western experts themselves consider the absence of the United States in the region as a sign of its decline.
I've brought you to Parliament today for a quick chat with MPs on the topic of stability in the region, its defenders and destroyers.
The US has a specific formula depending on the situation in every country to secure a foothold there, behaviors that are known by the whole world. Everyone knows that US behaviors in a specific way in the Middle East, South America, Africa and Southeast Asia, for example. You can see this country's behavior in the world. It is usually pursuing its own interests under the pretext of creating security in the world. That is, the cover of America's behavior is such that it portrays itself as a defender of the nations, but uses the excuse to safeguard its interests and exploit those nations behind the scenes. Iran is a vast country with a unique and ancient history. We have always been a pacifist.
I've heard advocates of US foreign policy say things like, America dropped the bomb to put a stop to the war, referring to America nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II, as if to say the bomb was meant for peace. It gives me confidence in my understanding that to the US, it's instability for stability, whereas Iran has been calling for peace and friendship for stability and safety.
They themselves destabilized the region. As is written in history, they started disintegrating Islamic countries. Their presence in the region is in an attempt to disintegrate great Islamic countries including Iran, Turkey, Iraq and Saudi Arabia, although some Arab countries are not mindful of this issue. They plan to disintegrate these countries to make them unable to defend themselves. They want to appear under the pretext of restoring security in the region and defending the regional nations, and at the same time plunder their wealth and resources.
Perhaps stability and security meant something else to the US in its heyday of imperialism, when smaller countries were more cooperative. But today it means securing the stability of US interests at any cost for others.
یک اندیشکده معروف آمریکایی، اندیشکده انترپرایز، یک کارشناس معروف این اندیشکده که اگر اسم بیارم خیلی ها که دستشون تو کار سیاست او رو میشناسن، او صریحاً این حرف رو زد. گفت ما خواهان ثبات در ایران و عراق و سوریه و لبنان نیستیم، فقط هم ایران نیست. مسئله اصلی لزوم یا عدم لزوم بی‌ثباتی در این کشورها نیست. یعنی بی‌ثباتی مسلمه که باید بی‌ثباتی در این کشورها به وجود بیاد، بلکه چگونگی ایجاد بی‌ثباتی مورد نظر است. بی‌ثباتی رو چجوری ایجاد کنیم؟ حالا یه وقت در یه جا با داعش، یه وقت با فتنه 88 و با امثال اینها و کارهایی که شما میبینید در منطقه دارن انجام میدن.
Jimmy Carter, the US president that lost Iran, although he did acknowledge later that Iran was never his to be lost, did laud this country as an island of stability. That was in 1977. Between 1972 and 77, the Shah or Iranian king splashed out on a defense build-up with petrodollars. The price of oil quadrupled in 1973, and he purchased more than $16 billion in arms from the US in 5 years, on top of about $3 billion per year in bilateral civilian trade. As soon as 1979, events took a sharp turn. The Islamic Revolution happened, and as 2,500 years of monarchy were toppled, America's island of stability turned into an island of nightmares. It's not what the US and other world powers expected, but it happened. Iranians had decided being an island of stability was no compliment if the country couldn't decide its own fate without foreign interference.
Oil was nationalized before the revolution. If the nation had waited a little, would things have changed, or would Iran carry on with its dependence on the West?
تحولاتی هم خب انجام شد مثل بحث همین نهضت.
Developments took place such as a national oil movement during the time of Dr. Mossadegh and Ayatollah Kashani, and a lot of effort was made and the people supported it. But then, when the Americans came back to power and brought back the Shah, they ousted Mossadegh, and in fact, the oil nationalization movement failed. Following that, not only did we remain dependent on the United States, but the Zionist regime also took oil from Iran. The war machine of the Zionist regime was working with Iranian oil. So was South Africa's. That is, the South African war machine against the blacks was also powered by Iranian oil.
A main revolutionary motto of the Iranians was independence. Why did they even feel a vacuum of independence, I asked.
خب خلای استقلال بسیار ملموس.
Well, a lack of independence was very tangible before the victory of the Islamic Revolution. The reason being that Reza Shah, Mohammad Reza's father, was brought to power by the British. There is no doubt about it. During the reign of Reza Shah, the whole country depended on three great powers, the British, the French and the Russian, which divided the country into the north and the south. Russia led Iran's oil in the north, while southern oil was controlled by Britain. France was also taking advantage of Iran.
Having suffered 8 years of an imposed war in isolation, referring to the Iraq-Iran war of the 1980s, Iran has built up its defense industry. US interference and involvement it deems a no-no, an outlook that outgoing US President Trump has justified by making it a habit to go back on deals, namely the JCPOA, or Iran nuclear deal.
The
reports from the US or European forums are mainly focused on our missiles. They always speak about our missiles, and they think that our defense power is limited to our missiles. Now, missiles is only one sector of our defense programs. We're as active in other sectors as we are in the missile sector. For example, ground defense, maritime defense, and underground defense. We're also working on other systems. We see how the world is watching us, but we never neglect our defense capability.
Not to go off on a tangent, US interference, even presence, has been a military presence and intervention. To balance power in the region, America has not settled for having its own boots on the ground even, but has created proxies. Its proxies are not your average militia. Rather, America has admittedly created or supported the most savage terror groups operating in the name of Islam. Yet it fights them selectively. I say selectively because it, the US, has acted vengefully against Iran, Syria and Iraq since their successful fight against Daesh or ISIS. Just before the General Soleimani assassination last year, Iran's leader accused the US of creating Daesh and saying the US actions in Syria and Iraq were intended to take revenge on the PMU for defeating ISIS, or Daesh. PMU stands for Popular Mobilization Units, an Iraqi state-sponsored umbrella organization. Now, why does the US see Iran affront to its foreign policy?
برای آمریکایی‌ها همیشه دنبال این بودن که با قلدری
After all, Americans have always sought to impose themselves on nations and governments through bullying, to pass themselves off as a superpower. The Islamic Revolution has emerged with the slogan of freedom of all nations of the world, but they don't want this slogan to spread. 4 decades after the victory of the Islamic Revolution, we have been able to awaken many of the world's nations with our slogans of seeking justice and freedom. With our own cultural revolution, America doesn't want the awakenings in the oppressed nations.
US propaganda is riddled with controversy. In spite of its sporadic admissions to the contrary, the United States still ostensibly claims it is seeking stability in the world. It claims it is Iran and allies that are seeking terrorism and reducing stability. But history reflects the truth like a mirror. Iran has a no-first strike policy. It has waged no wars in over 200 years. That's about as long as the US's whole lifespan, nearly all of which has been spent on war. And now it looks on the verge of a second civil war.
When we review the US culture over the last 200 to 300 years, we see that wherever the US has stepped in South America, in Vietnam, in Africa, there's been war, bloodletting, massacre, and violation of human rights. That has caused insecurity. Therefore, I know no positive example of the US presence in the world to have brought security.
It's understandable. While the traveler will muddy waters to catch his fish, residents would opt for protecting their waters for sanitation and sustainable use. Even with selfish intentions, Iran's interests lie in lack of instability in the region. To establish and maintain all-round relations, especially trade relations with neighboring states, Iran needs the region secure, and it has done something about it, or in some cases made recommendations for sustainable stability and security in West Asia or the Middle East. Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. Iran has constantly been in the spotlight for its considerable influence in the 5 states, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and Yemen. And also, the Palestinian issue is of great consequence to Iran, both geostrategically and for humanitarian reasons. Before getting into each of our 5 states separately, I'd like to invite you to a quick media review to see what other outlets have to say. Here's how the topic of terror and instability, stability versus instability, looks in other outlets. Beginning with China Daily. US duplicity on terrorism, condemnable. Terrorism is the common enemy of all humans, and terrorists have caused great harm to all countries and people around the world. So all countries should treat terrorism and terrorists as potent threats. However, Washington often reacts fiercely to terrorist attacks in the US or its ally countries and stands united with them. Yet when terrorists launch attacks in countries which the US sees as rivals or competitors, it remains indifferent and even tries to use so-called ethnic and or religious problems in these countries to dilute the issue or give it a political twist. Therefore, it is time for the US to abandon double standards on terrorism and stop supporting its favored terror groups. Otherwise, it would also get burned by the fire it has been fanning. We've something from Tehran Times quoting an Indian professor, Ashok Swain,
who says the US role in the Middle East or West Asia has never been constructive. Swain, a professor of peace and conflict research at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research from Uppsala University, believes Washington has been seeking its own interests in the region. Its interest has never been for the Middle East security and development, but for its own security and development. The Indian professor says it will not only be difficult, but in many cases impossible for the Biden administration to bring back the mask of a fair adjudicator, which the USA has been wearing for decades. Fars News quotes Iran's top security official, who underlines the necessity of a US pullout from the region. The Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, SNSC, Ali Shamkhani, stressed that the withdrawal of American forces from the regional states is a necessity. The US has intensified its measures to foment insecurity in West Asia in the past year, and the climax of this behavior was the cowardly assassination of anti-terrorism commanders General Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Shamkhani continued, the Islamic Republic of Iran is determined to take a harsh revenge on the masterminds and perpetrators of this historical crime to stop the US and its agents' continued terrorist and anti-security actions which stir tension in the region and force them to leave the region. And that's what was on offer from other media outlets. Stay with me, for there's more to come.
Iran's interest in creating stability in the region. To demonstrate that by example, let's take a look at Iran's stance towards each of 5 states. In Iraq, Iran seeks stability because it has common economic, security, religious, cultural, and other interests in this country. The US presence in Iraq has killed hundreds of thousands of people so far, and so, in Iran's view, a US presence will not bring peace here on out either. A warring US presence in Iraq began in 2003. And if terror can be separated from invading a country, given the US is at war in the Middle East at large, but says it's fighting its pet terror groups here, why did it assassinate General Soleimani? Soleimani was Iran's frontman against Daesh. Following the Daesh or ISIS surge into northern Iraq over 5 years ago, Iran moved swiftly by arming Iraqi Kurdish fighters and supporting Baghdad with military advisors. It also provided training for Shia militias in a counteroffensive against Daesh. By fighting the relentless terror group, it kept them off European borders even. Had it not been for Iran's confrontation with Daesh, that bloodthirsty group would probably have taken over Baghdad, and its supporters, the United States and Saudi Arabia, would have just continued to hesitate in confronting it.
What the Islamic Republic of Iran wants is to establish security in the Gulf of Oman, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Persian Gulf. Insecurity will benefit nobody. Naturally, we would never like our neighbor's home to be set on fire, because even if the fire does not spread, the smoke will reach us. That's why we prefer the region to be secure and calm. However, hegemonic nations prefer to create insecurity in the region.
Similarly, in Syria, Iran seeks peace and security partly by joining the fight against ruthless terrorist groups. Iran's stance is to stand by the Syrian people, the Aleppo liberation, and establishing a truce as key to establishing peace and stability in Syria.
Iran maintains influence in the region because it makes its own decisions and chooses its own friends. There are 2 types of influence, legitimate and illegitimate. Legitimate influence is when a country, one of Iran's neighbors or a more distant one, invites us to help it counter terrorism. For example, Syria and Iraq invited us. We do not intend to impose our views on these countries and interfere in the internal affairs of these countries. But because they wanted us to help them, and because we have a common security risk, we go ahead and help them as an advisor.
As for Palestine, Iran seeks a peaceful solution to the Palestinian issue, but believes it will not be resolved the way the United States and Israel have in mind, not by expanding illegal Jewish settlements on Palestinian land by consensus with others, that is. Resistance and referendum is the only viable solution to the Palestinian issue, according to Iran. That is to say, all original Palestinians of any faith displaced anywhere in the world must themselves decide their own fate by referendum. In Afghanistan, Iran seeks stability because with an insecure Afghanistan, the influx of refugees into Iran will increase. Also, drug trafficking towards this country will increase.
They came to Afghanistan 18 years ago saying they wanted to uproot terrorism. But the result today is a tenfold, even 100-fold increase in drug production, growing insecurity in Afghanistan, migration of Afghans to Europe, Iran and Pakistan. They said they wanted to remove Saddam because of chemical arms which were never unearthed. Today, the Americans themselves, under the pretext of fighting Daesh, have triggered chaos in the entire region.
Iran believes intra-Afghan talks can lead to the process of establishing peace and stability with no need for third parties to interfere in the process. Abdul Ghafoor Leval, the Afghan ambassador to Iran, expressed gratitude to this country for its support of the Afghan peace process, establishment of the legitimate government in that country, and hosting Afghan migrants for several decades. Iran's regional presence and intervention is understood, but one country raises eyebrows. I asked for justification to Iran's cooperation in Yemen.
As stated in its constitution, the Islamic Republic of Iran must defend the oppressed in the world. But this defense is legitimate, that is at the request of those countries. The Yemenis also got help from us. We do not have a military presence in Yemen, but we have an advisory presence. We will help the Yemenis as much as we can and defend the rights of the Yemeni people in the international arena.
Iran calls for an end to Saudi and allied attacks on Yemen, and for Yemenis to decide their own destiny. In doing so, Iran submitted a 4-point Yemen peace plan to the United Nations. The plan announced by Foreign Minister Zarif in 2015 calls for an immediate ceasefire and an end of all foreign military attacks, humanitarian assistance, and a resumption of broad national dialogue and establishment of an inclusive national unity government. The international community will no doubt have to get more effectively involved, as instability has been allowing terrorist groups to gain a foothold in Yemen. I asked, why does the US pursue endless conflict everywhere, especially in West Asia?
Theorists have always said that seizing control of the Middle East is the necessary step towards world domination. One reason is the region's geographical situation, that is located on the crossway of 3 continents. The second reason is the cultural situation. The region is where prophets had their revelations and heavenly books descended. The third and the most important reason is that 60% of the world's energy is supplied from this region. These unique characteristics have made this region a target for great world powers and colonialists from the United States to Britain and others.
To attempt the more everyday aspects of life and Iran's interest in its regional market. Iran's economy is based on industry and agriculture, and its service sector has been answering its domestic needs because of quality manpower. Now there's an overflow to be exported to regional states, but that requires stability and security in the neighborhood. The US presence is a problem, as are its sanctions. It constantly imposes sanctions on Iran so that other states can't connect to Iranian goods and services. And then the US imposes its own goods and services on those countries. So you can see, it's a constant chain of problems for this country.
If only insecurity would stop at harming the mutual benefits reaped from trade. Lives are being lost and countries are suffering upheaval. And so, Iran seeks US withdrawal from the entire region because it agrees and believes that a US presence will only increase insecurity and provoking public sentiment. It was in May 2020 that the Iranian President Rouhani pointed to problems faced by countries in the region, calling for their cooperation to overcome those problems, which have remained the coronavirus and falling oil prices, security problems, and most importantly, US interference in these countries. His focus was on Iraq at the time. He expressed satisfaction that the political process in Iraq had reached a point when all Iraqi groups and tribes were alongside each other.
That's it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Do return to the box at the same times next week and each week after, as you never know what's on. And don't forget to leave your comments and topic requests. Bye for now.